Perhaps it was the pleasure the good spirit had in showing off this power of his, or else it was his own kind, generous, hearty nature and his sympathy with all poor men that had him take Scrooge directly to the house of Scrooge's clerk. For there they went, and on the threshold of the door the spirit smiled, and stopped to bless Bob Cratchitt's dwelling with the sprinklings of his torch. Then up rose Mrs. Cratchitt, Bob's wife, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, but brave in ribbons, which are cheap and make a goodly show for sixpence, and laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda, second of her daughters. Meanwhile, Master Peter Cratchitt plunged a fork into a saucepan of potatoes and got the corners of his monstrous shirt collars, Bob's private property, bestowed upon his son and heir in honor of the day, into his mouth. Then two smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelled the goose and known it for their own, and basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion. "There's father coming," cried the two young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. In came little Bob the father, with at least 3 feet of scarf exclusive of the fringe hanging down before him, his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch, and his limbs supported by an iron frame. Belinda ran into her father's arms, and the two young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off into the washroom that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper. "And how did little Tim behave?" asked Mrs. Cratchitt, when Bob had hugged his daughter to his heart's content. "As good as gold," said Bob, "and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful, sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me, coming home, that he hoped the people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember on Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see." Bob's voice was tremulous as he told them this, and trembled even more when he said, Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. Master Peter and the two young Cratchits went off to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. Such a bustle ensued that you would have thought a goose the rarest of all birds, a feathered phenomenon to which a black swan was a matter of course. And in truth, it was something very like it in that house. At last the dishes were set on, grace was said, and Cratchit seated all around the table. This was succeeded by a breathless pause, as Mrs. Cratchit, looking slowly up and down the carving knife, prepared to plunge it in the breast. But when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose around the board. And even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat upon the table with the handle of his knife and feebly cried, "Hurrah!" There never was such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there ever was such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavor, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by mashed potatoes and applesauce, it was sufficient dinner for the whole family. Indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit observed with great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone left upon the dish, they hadn't ate it all at last. But now, the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witnesses to take the pudding up and bring it in. Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break in turning out. Suppose somebody should have gotten over the wall of the backyard and stolen it while they were making merry with the goose. All sorts of horrors were supposed. Hello, a great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. Oh, a wonderful pudding. Bob Cratchitt said, and calmly too, that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by his wife since their marriage. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said it was at all a small pudding for a large family. It would have been flat heresy to do so. Any Cratchitt would have blushed to hint at such a thing. With dinner being done, the Cratchitt family drew all around the hearth, and Bob poured each a cup of hot steaming stuff from a jug, while the chestnuts spluttered noisily on the fire. "A Merry Christmas, my dears," said Bob. "God bless us." Which all the family re-echoed. "God bless us," said Tiny Tim, last of all. "Everyone." He sat very close by his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him. "Spirit," said Scrooge, with an interest he had never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live." "I see a vacant seat by the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without a master, carefully preserved. If these shadows be not altered by the future, the child will die." "Oh no, Spirit, no, no, say he will be spared." "If these shadows be not altered by the future, none other of my race shall find him here. What then? If he be like to die, he had better do it, and reduce the surplus population." Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the Spirit, and was overcome with penitence and grief. He lifted his eyes again on hearing his own name. "I'll give you Mr. Scrooge," said Bob, "the founder of the feast." "The founder of the feast, indeed," said Mrs. Cratchitt, reddening. "I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it." "My dear," was Bob's mild answer, "Christmas Day?" "It should be Christmas Day, I'm sure, when one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. I'll drink his health for the day's sake and for yours, not for his. Long life to him." The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings which had no heartiness. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, and he didn't care 2 pence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for full 5 minutes. When it had passed, they were 10 times merrier than before, by the mere relief of Scrooge the Baleful being done with. The chestnuts in the jug went round and round, and by they had a song about a lost child traveling in the snow, from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice and sang it very well indeed. There was nothing of high mark in the Cratchitts' merriment. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time. And when they faded and looked merrier still in the bright sprinklings of the Spirit's torch at parting, Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim until the last. As Scrooge and the Spirit went along the streets, the brightness of the roaring fires in kitchens, parlors, and all sorts of rooms was wonderful. It was no great surprise after a few moments' travel to hear a hearty laugh. it was a much greater surprise to recognize it as his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room with the spirit standing smiling by his side, looking at that same nephew with approving affability. "Ah, ha, ha, ha," laughed Scrooge's nephew. "He said that Christmas was a humbug, as I live." And all the assembled company laughed with him. And he believed it too. "More shame for him, Fred," said Scrooge's niece indignantly. She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty, with a dimpled, surprised-looking capital face, a ripe little mouth that looked as though it was made to be kissed, all sorts of good little dots about her chin that melted into one another when she laughed, and the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw in any little creature's head. "I am sorry for him," said Scrooge's nephew. "I couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers from his ill whims? Himself, always. Here he takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come dine with us. And what's the consequence? He don't lose much of a dinner." "Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner," interrupted Scrooge's niece. And everybody else said the same. And they must be allowed to have been competent judges, for they had just had dinner, and with dessert upon the table, were clustered around the fire by lamplight. "Well, I'm very glad to hear it," said Scrooge's nephew. "What do you say, Topper?" Topper had clearly got his eye on one of Scrooge's niece's sisters, for he answered that a bachelor was a wretched outcast who had no right to express an opinion on the subject. Whereat Scrooge's niece's sister, the plump one in the lace tucker, blushed. After dinner, there was a game of blind man's bluff. Of course there was. And I no more believe that Topper was really blind than I believe he had eyes in his boots. My opinion is, it was a done thing between him and Scrooge's nephew, and the ghost of Christmas present knew it. The way he went after that plump sister in the lace tucker was an outrage on the credulity of human nature. Knocking over chairs, tumbling down fire irons, smothering himself among the curtains, bumping up against the piano. Everywhere she went, there went he. He wouldn't catch anyone else. And when at last he caught her, when, in spite of all her silken rustlings and her rapid flutterings past him, he got her into a corner whence there was no escape, then his behavior was the most execrable. He seemed to think it necessary to assure himself of her identity by placing a certain ring upon her finger and a certain chain about her neck. Oh, it was vile, monstrous. No doubt she gave him her opinion of it when, another blind man being in office, they were so very confidential together behind the curtains. Scrooge so enjoyed the game of blind man's bluff that he begged the spirit to be allowed to stay until the guests had departed. But this, the spirit said, could not be done. "Here is another game," said Scrooge, "but 1/2 hour, spirit, one more." It was a game called Yes or No, where Scrooge's nephew must think of something, and the rest must find out what, him only answering to their questions yes or no, as the case was. The brisk fire of questioning to which he was exposed elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal, rather a disagreeable animal, a savage animal, an animal that grunted and growled sometimes, and talked sometimes, and lived in London, and went about the streets, and wasn't led by anyone, and wasn't kept in a zoo, and was never sold in a market, and wasn't a horse, or an ass, or a cow, or a bull, or a tiger, or a dog, or a pig, or a cat, or a bear. At every fresh question that was put to him, Scrooge's nephew burst into a fresh roar of laughter, and was so inexpressibly tickled that he was obliged to get up off the sofa and stand. Ha 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 ha! At last the plump sister falling into a similar state, cried out, I know what it is, Fred. I have found it out. I know what it is. Well, what is it? Said Fred. It's your Uncle Scrooge. Which it most certainly was. Admiration was the universal sentiment, but some objected that the answer to is it a bear ought to have been yes. Well, he has given us plenty of merriment, I am sure, said Scrooge's nephew, and it would be ungrateful not to drink his health. Here is a glass of mulled wine, ready to our hand at the moment, and I say, Uncle Scrooge. Well, Uncle Scrooge, they all cried. A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to the old man, whatever he is. Uncle Scrooge had imperceptibly grown so gay and light of heart that he would have pledged the unaware company in return and thanked them with an inaudible speech if the ghost had given him time. But the whole scene faded away with the last breath of the last word spoken by his nephew, and Scrooge and the spirit were again upon their travels.